Okay, so thank you to everyone who has come out for the definitive and final session of Real Abstraction, the conference. For this wrap-up session, we'll be holding a discussion. And we have all of our conference presenters here, with the exceptions of Roberto Finelli, Alberto Toscano, as well as Maya Gonzalez, who couldn't make it. Also joining us today is Sami Khatib, who unfortunately wasn't able to present at the conference because he was traveling. But hopefully he'll offer us some illuminating insights today during our discussion. So I've written down, I don't know if everyone saw, just maybe as a guideline, though we don't have to stick to it in any strict sense. I've written down a few potential suggestions for discussion on the website. Have you guys seen that yet? On the Roundtable section of Foreign Objects website? Yeah?
They're great. They're great questions.
Okay. Thank you. So I'd like to, maybe I could proceed. Why don't I go ahead and read the first question? Would that be okay with everyone? Yeah? Okay. So the first question is, what are the limits of real abstraction as a means of analyzing developments under contemporary capitalism? For Sohn-Rethel, commodity-producing societies are epistemically governed to a greater or lesser degree by a principle of equivalence. This is to say that as real abstraction, or to be more precise, non-empirical abstraction, is structurally homologous with commodity exchange, it manifests in quantitative commensuration. When we measure the weight of two things, include they both weigh 3 pounds, for instance, their qualitative differences are elided in favor of reduction to a principle of measure. Yet if one believes, as is common within post-operaismo, for example, that the labor theory of value no longer holds within contemporary capitalism due to, e.g., financialization and the extensive subsumption of free time, then it would seem that the thinking of real abstraction requires revision. And I'm thinking here in particular of some of the contributions of Italian theorists like Lorenzo Solario and Paulo Verno, right, who were arguing for the potential transformation of real abstraction in the context of cognitive capitalism. But what do you guys, any thoughts on that issue? I mean, I think one very basic thing that probably has to be discussed here is like, you know, and I think Jaleh and I were talking about this as well, is it has to do with the application of the law of value, right, in the context of cognitive capitalism. So Negri, for example, has said that, you know, the law of value doesn't really hold, right, because in a sense we're constantly producing value, right? We're constantly engaged in that process, right? So there can be no tidy division that's erected between work and non-work, as it were. Does anyone have any thoughts on that?
Well, it's characteristic of Negri's anti-Marxism that of course, from Marx, those are dialectically joined and determinately abstracted across successive eras of capitalist development in the time space of capitalism. So I think that I'm not sure if I'm really understanding the link between the debate over the end of the law of value, which seems quite speculative to me when it should be a concrete matter of economic history, and the real abstractions of value. So I'm wondering if we can maybe flesh that out a little bit.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the idea here, and I mean, like, I wouldn't, you know, I'm not an expert like in this line of thinking, right? And I'm kind of reading off Toscano and people like that. But I think the idea here is that, you know, I mean, if we follow these discussions, and this has been one thing that's been constant, I think, throughout this conference about, you know, the way that, you know, the law of value, of course, emerging because of this sort of, you know, organization of circulation and production, right, or coordination of them, which is constitutive of value as such, right, within a capitalist context. But I think the idea is that if that relation ceases to exist or ceases to be functional in the way that it was previously imagined, right, that would have a serious implication for the way that value functions as an operative or metaphysical principle within society, right, or as a real abstraction, to put it differently. Does anyone have any? I mean, maybe you guys have any.
I think you just answered yourself. So there would be two ways that I would go about answering that. Although I think the claim that the labor theory of value is increasingly irrelevant is really a specious argument, because Capital Flight would tell us that the labor theory of value is as active and relevant and germane as ever. It's just not necessarily in our own backyards in the global north. So we come to find all of these other arguments that we're claiming would replace it. But that aside, because this isn't the place for those kinds of debates. In answer to your question, I think I would piggyback off of Sami Khatib's work, which is actually where I gained most of my sort of secondary grasp on Sohn-Rethel, and say that once you have this kind of metaphysic in place, it takes on its own logic. It's generative of itself. So I think the problem of real abstraction is more relevant. And I thought a lot about the question, what are the limits of this framework in thinking about our present moment? And the more I think about it, the more I think really there are none, which is instantiated in this conference, right? We've been talking about the history of sexuality, the history of aesthetics, ecology, the problem of nature. I mean, this has been, as many have noted, a very multidisciplinary, polyvalent conference, which is itself proof of the cogency of this concept. And then back to the first problem, I think that so-called financialization would only augment or take to the next degree the problem of real abstraction, insofar as it makes the market even more important over the quote unquote hidden abode of production. So that I think my answer would have two components. One, in a nod to Khatib, the problem of a new metaphysic, and the other, the ever increasing, the kind of monstrous omnipotence of the market within financialization, make this rubric all the more critical, I think.
Can you say more about this, Jaleh, about financialization in the market? Because my reading, and I'm happy to see it differently, is that financialization is the anti-market par excellence, is the world historical movement towards monopoly capitalism, and especially some form of state finance, anti-market monopoly capitalism.
Yeah, that's another interesting kind of debate. I think I've been spending a great deal of time with David Harvey's work in an attempt to sort of work my own way out of the quote unquote Brenner debates. But it seems to me that financialization is when the market accelerates the sale of debt. So you have the kind of primary market, which is as ever MCM, cycle of commodities, and so on and so forth. But then debt becomes another kind of commodity, sucking everything into its vortex. I mean, I'd be happy to be corrected on that, but
no, I'm just, if I can keep this very short, and then I'll listen to everyone else. It seems to me that there are at least two different ways of looking at this. One is real abstraction is emerging out of the cash nexus and circulation in class societies, so on and so forth. The other is, if we look at the actual history of financialization, it's not market driven, but state driven. And it's state driven through various incarnations of militarized accumulation and state military industrial complexes. And indeed, those might be two different kinds of real abstractions floating around, but they imply different kinds of political choices as well. One about the restraint of the market, the other about the liquidation of bourgeois power, if you will, political power, rather. I don't have it worked out either.
Well, it's actually, I want to, if I can add really.
That's interesting. No, go
okay,
ahead.
Sorry, did you want to, okay.
Oh, no.
I just wanted to add really quickly, I think it's interesting, and we've been talking about this really throughout the week about, I think, or throughout the conference, but the tendency to sort of generalize over hastily about the end of capitalism, as it were, right? Or you know, the end of anything like a mode of production resembling what Marx describes in Capital. I think it's really interesting because I was reading an article about how economics functions in China, right? And how it's, you know, practiced by state institutions, and in some respects, how people are educated about it. And, you know, I think if we're looking at this whole problematic, right, what we're really looking at is the loss of like a self-consistent notion of value, right? That can really undergird, you know, economic practice or function sort of monolithically within the society, right? And what it was pointing out was that, you know, in the United States, if you look at how people are educated, and I think you have this coming out of marginalism, right? The idea eventually, you know, if you look at the early economists, right, they're actually trying to develop a notion of like, well, what is the substratum of price, right? You know, you know, of course, for Marx, we see that it's labor in the context of capitalism, and he draws different conclusions from that than Smith does, for example. But in any case, this is a sort of constant, right? The search for value is something which grounds and is explanative of price to some degree. And it was very interesting because it basically said that in the United States, what people have been sort of educated in is this idea that, you know, if you're creating money, that's good, right? You know, but this goal was sort of relinquished. But if you look in China, like when banks loan out money, when public banks loan out money, for example, what they ask you is, you know, is this actually like a means of production that you're creating, right? So they're actually de facto applying, right, you know, a notion of value that is in many respects more consistent, you know, with these sort of heuristics that were developed in the 19th century, right? And then I think that relates to their entire sort of society and its economic reproduction, right? So maybe there is, you know, I don't agree with Negri what he's saying, but I just want to say that, you know, I think we do have, you know, in terms of financialization, in terms of monopoly capital, in terms of the sort of implicit, you know, commodification of free time, I think we do have issues theoretically that we have to address in the Western context, and that has to be acknowledged. But I think what the mistake that's often made is assuming that because these transformations have taken place in the West, that they're indicative of a truly global transformation, right? You know, because like normally it's like America is the engine of consumption and China is the engine of production. Well, what is Marx? Production, right? That's the first thing we look at, right? The hidden abode. So I think that can be problematic as well. Any further thoughts on that?
Yeah,
I think Ben.
Yeah, Ben, go ahead.
I think the confusion stems from Marx's commodity theory of money. It's just rubbish. Money's not a commodity.
Okay, is that?
And that's where the confusion could come with what Negri's going on about. I don't quite understand the labor theory of money. And yes, it's to do with value, but money's in and of itself is not a commodity. It's a politically contested social technology, and it's riven by class conflict. It's not neutral.
But maybe I can say something to Antonio Negri's idea, because on the one hand, it's true. He so simplified, he says, or he speaks like something like the end of labor theory of value. But what he aims for is some kind of biopolitical turn of the labor theory of value. And I think he has three arguments. You already find it in Empire and even before, that he says, so first, labor is not measurable, at least not as it was or it seems to be in the industrial age. So where we can individualize labor from individual labor forces. Second, he says this value production has become the potence of the multitude and has become general intellect. And the third thing is, he say, also there it's not really a labor production anymore, but it's more that new technologies, especially by neoliberalism and by finance, making new forms of appropriation, which has something to do with all these endowment and these introducing money in the system and all the things which has to do with finance capitalism. These are his three main arguments why we need a turn of the classical labor theory of value, which for him in a way was true for the industrial age, and come to a biopolitical turn, which he of course bases on Foucault, but also is also very known by other post-operists like Christian Marazzi and others. And I think it has much to do that simply the organic composition of capital is different. So we don't have any longer the classical organic composition like we have in the industrial age, where the two components were in the fabric system, but it's just dispersed in the whole society. And so in the way his empirical observations are true, but it's more that capital becomes its own idea or its own concept of productivity adequate, because the productivity or the comments of valorization don't have to be industrial forms, be it a means of production or be it the masses of the labor forces. It can be all kinds of work. So I think this is so. In a way, on the empirical level, he is true, but this is not the end of labor theory of value. It's only that the organic composition of capital has become a different, what he even describes when he speaks about the multitude and general intellect, etc.
I just want to pass to Sami. He had something to say.
Yeah, thanks, Frank. As almost always, I agree to what you have said. Yes. Anyways, my work is adapted to you, so I just give a little footnote to that. Maybe looking at contemporary developments of capitalism sheds a new light on that which capitalism used to be before, or how we read capitalism in earlier periods. So obviously a commodity is not a neutral thing. It is unstable and is class struggle driven. So the difference between money versus commodity probably is not a point on stability or to abstract from political struggles or political economic constellation of a society. Then second, obviously value seems to be not what value should be. A solid standard that I can use and quantify. Obviously, that very standard is in motion. You can also say value doesn't exist. It only exists as a vector. It will have been value when it is capitalized. So all these kind of static, non-dialectical snapshots of capitalism maybe are interesting insofar as they historicize the viewpoint on capitalism. But that also means we are still in history. So in a way, debating that is an answer to the question, does it still matter? Obviously it does, but I would like to put the question the other way around. Instead of asking, is a real abstraction still a critical tool or something that could stimulate an interesting theory or whatever, an emancipatory knowledge on capitalism? Or is there kind of a trajectory towards more or less? By the way, bracketing the question, what is real abstraction? Obviously, you have different views. I already got that, and it's impossible even in 1 month discussing that to agree on anything there. But having said that, you could also say, what is the future of non-real abstraction, of empirical abstraction, you called it? I would say empty abstraction or intellectual abstraction. What is the future of what Hegel called abstract thinking? And that's probably quite interesting. And I think there is kind of a borrowed future, but there might be, that kind of trajectory is very problematic and crisis driven. And I'm not so sure what the future of that is. Real abstraction might be there, but it can be hacked, it can be modified. Whether it is still in communism is pretty much the question of, is there still society? Is there still alienation? Is there still some kind of unconscious mode of, the social relation? Obviously, that we totally differ on that. But what is, I would like to rephrase it in along the terms of, what is the future of bad abstraction? And I think they still have a future, but maybe not that long as financial capitalism assumes or bets on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I like your point about how dialectical it is, and that's why I'm resistant, on one hand to, and Frank Engster, you've elaborated a little bit, but on one hand to someone like Negri who would embrace it, at times it would seem a generalization, right, about, how the law of value doesn't function within these transform contexts. And on the other hand, I think someone like Paul Cockshott, who progresses toward, I think, quite non-dialectical essentialization, right, of the centrality of labor vis-a-vis the law of value. I think one thing maybe when we read Capital that we don't sometimes focus on is how delicate the assumptions are that underlie this entire edifice, right, in terms of the relationship between value and labor. For instance, I mean, when Marx talks about super profits in capital, right? This sort of situation where, you know, you have a superior technological implement, right, to another company, right? And that allows you to create super profits. Well, the only way in which that wouldn't manifest, let's say, in a genuine change of value is because what's presupposed is that the technological implements available to other capitalists are equalized, which forms a kind of norm, right, against which, you know, the difference is not one of value, but only profit. So already, if we're talking about a situation where technological implements are constantly changing, right, which we see, I think, more and more with business, if we're talking about a situation, for example, in which, you know, patent laws have become very, very intrusive and obstructed companies from, you know, simply copying the technologies that are adopted by their competitors, then we have a situation where that's changing, right? So I mean, my feeling of it is always like, well, you know, Marx is correct about, you know, I guess what they've called the labor theory of value, or the value theory of labor, as Diane Elson would call it. But we also have to be clear about how we contextualize that, right? And the limits of that contextualization, right? I want to add one other thing too about thinking about the future of real abstraction. I think we should remember Sohn-Rethel's own comments on this in Intellectual and Manual Labor. And one thing Sohn-Rethel basically says is he draws a kind of analogy, right? And he says that, you know, of course, he views kind of like Newtonian, you know, the principle of inertia and Newtonian science as corresponding with the development of the capitalist mode of production. And he basically says, you know, in the same way that he implies this comparison, in the same way that you know, these scientific systems or ways of thinking characteristic of modernity have now been, I'm not going to say jettisoned, but supplanted by much more sort of aleatory and mysterious, you know, apparatuses in terms of physics. We see today that, you know, the question of how to maintain capitalism, right, what the state has to do to maintain it, you know, all of these things becomes at the same time exceedingly complex, right? It requires a sort of vast bureaucratic administration. Like, you can't just leave this to the processes of calculation of the market, right? So any thoughts on that?
Well, there's 3 or 4 different points which are all great that you're underscoring.
Okay, well, just anything.
Well, the last point that you draw on, which is the emergence of modern science as itself a producer of real abstraction, or what I would call increasingly ruling abstractions, linked very, very tightly to imperial projects, needs to be underscored, because for me, as some of you know, that this is a way of really unpacking some of the greatest potential of Sohn-Rethel's work on real abstraction. And Toscano really opened it up for me, that this is about hegemony, but it's also about, beyond a hegemony, a Gramscian perspective. It's also about the real abstractions that emerge in order to make the law of value work, not only as a system of labor power, but also as a system of unpaid work, and going beyond the naive empiricism of even many of those on the ecological left of seeing, well, nature is just there. So that becomes a very different way of approaching these questions, to begin to understand science, the civilizing project, the production of nature as an ideological project, both in terms of governance, but also in terms of making legible. That gives us a very different standpoint from, I think, what many people have been referring to, because it's so commonplace, the labor theory of value. But Marx was a critique of the labor theory of value. Marx said, yes, labor power is fundamental, but labor power works in relation to other webs of life that are also mobilized. And when I say other webs of life, of course, Marx is always reminding us, what is labor power? Specifically, harness natural force. And also drawing on the ways, famously in The Working Day, on the ways in which that dynamic of the reproduction of labor power depends on imperialism. So there, that context, that trinity of capital, science, and empire is quite fundamental for the other sets of ruling abstractions that circulate and have enabled the dictatorship of capital.
Thank you. Are there further comments to that, or maybe do you guys want to move on to the next question, or how do we feel? Okay.
Oops.
Oh, continue. It's Frank. Continue.
Yeah, I just wanted to emphasize with the argument Jason was starting, because we were a bit struggling during the conference. What is the real kernel of Sohn-Rethel's concept of real abstraction? And I think so. The real kernel is that his Kantian starting point, asking, not questioning if natural science is true or right or adequate, but saying natural science in a way is true. How is it possible? And so Sohn-Rethel was obsessed, or the other way around. Why he was so interested in this concept of real abstraction is because he was obsessed with the big question: how is it possible that a truth, a universal, ahistorical truth, has historical and social origins? And his idea, so he was, in a way, he was emphasizing natural science as something which is really a universal truth which we can't overcome. And his idea of socialism or of communism was not to overcome our or the bourgeois or the capitalist concept of natural science, but in a way to socially making some kind of a total, he called it a total social synthesis. Why? Because the labor process is organized like the natural process, and the producer is totally embedded in a way in a production process formed by natural science. So this is quite interesting, because it was in a way, it was even worse than the Soviet system was proclaiming. And I would be interesting how Jason Moore sees it, because in a way, Alfred Sohn-Rethel is exactly this Promethean, so obsessive idea of totally using natural science for a totally socialist mode of production, where in a way that was also coming back to the early writings of Karl Marx. We have a naturalization of the human and the humanization of nature. Maybe Jason Moore, you have an idea how to deal with this.
Well, clear, you outlined it very, very well, that it's a kind of capitulation to bourgeois naturalism. And it's really striking that, the book is published, what, 1970? This is after a century for which most of that century, mainstream science regarded eugenics as a fundamental truth. So we can begin to see the dangers of that. As for Soviet science, yes, there was Lysenkoism, but there was also there was Vernadsky, there was a discovery of adaptogens, there was an extraordinary wave, even within a Prometheanism, like in the West, an extraordinary sort of set of accomplishments, and we can glimpse some of the openings that were there through the revolutionary process. So I think that's the mistake. Of course, in my view, what we want is a proletarian science that will enact the supersession of bourgeois universalism in science. That doesn't mean we get rid of building bridges that stay up or airplanes that can stay aloft. But if we look at the universalist claims of bourgeois naturalism of science, that's not a pretty picture, right? And it's totally linked to Malthusianism, as we see today in the discourse over the climate crisis, right? So we have these arrogant figures like Johann Rockström of the Potsdam Institute saying, well, we need bankers to solve the climate crisis. That's where science leads. It leads to a politics of the bankers and the technocrats.
But I think in a way, and I agree with you, Jason. I mean, actually, a lot of Sohn-Rethel's indications about science are really, really ambiguous within intellectual and manual labor, right? At one point he says, well, maybe sort of like, post-Newtonian physics is kind of just like junk science that doesn't really have any correspondence with like manual labor, which is like, that's like Sohn-Rethel, like the vulgar Sohn-Rethel, and then like at other times he's like, well, maybe it's outstripping the logic, which capitalism relies on for its continuance. And another time he's like, well, classical physics still will have a plausible operation within a communist society. So he gives all these very mixed indications. But one thing I've been trying to think about myself, and you see this in the work, is how seizing on, in particular, Sohn-Rethel's comments about how, post-Newtonian physics potentially outstrips the logic capitalism relies on for its continuance. I mean, I mentioned this in my presentation, but I think it's very, very important to note how significant Newton's physical theories are for the formation of Adam Smith's theory of value. right? And I've said this about inertia, right? For Adam Smith, you know, value or labor is productive of value until another input enters into the process, right? You know, and in that context, you can say, well, you know, Marx, by not totally discarding this, but by, you know, contextualizing it in a very specific way, is maybe performing a similar gesture to what happens within subsequent physical developments. But I think it's a good example of how, as much as science is capable of being hijacked, I like to use this to turn them off Stalin, you know, bourgeois science and proletarian science. I know you, I see more using that, which I like as well. But I think if I have a definition of proletarian science, if I can use this sort of silly term, I think it's, you know, science when it's sort of pushed to its apotheosis and it actually challenges the governing structure, right? The sort of metaphysical abstractions upon which it depends, right? So, you know, I think we can see within climate science and ecology, right? That's also challenging, right? A lot of the suppositions about how our global capitalist economy functions, right? Not completely, but there is that aspect. Does anyone have any thoughts on that? Or?
It goes in precisely the opposite direction. I'll be quiet, but I just want to say, no, I mean, the Anthropocene Earth system science is completely tied to an imperialist neo-Malthusian model of the world that is committed to planetary management by a hypothetical imperial condominium. I mean, back to a Kautskyite fantasy, but it's limits to growth, planetary management, the dictatorship of capital to sustain the present accumulation of wealth and power.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But
you absolutely does not challenge. I mean, the number of the number of individual scientists outside of somebody like figures like Lewis and Maslin, who are major figures in this field, who support anything on the left. I mean, maybe some of you can mention a few, but they're all sort of either neoliberals or sort of right-wing social democrats and neo-Malthusians, all of them.
Well, we live in a bourgeois society, so I think it follows that, you know, most of our science is going to be, there's going to be bourgeois hegemony within those fields. I mean, Marx's, you know, way of seeing economics was never, you know, generalized or operationalized within, you know, the field of business or economics itself, right? But it was still, you know, using those resources, you know, in an attempt to create something different. So I don't think that it requires that that be dominant within the sciences to say that there's the possibility of thinking, you know, a kind of emancipatory apotheosis of science that can emerge in that context. I mean, I'm thinking of Richard Seaford here, right? Actually, I'm going to give a complimentary analogy because, you know, Richard Seaford obviously has this, you know, strongly materialist analysis of you know, ancient societies. But he's also said, like, this is not at all the norm in the field, to the point where, you know, translations and so forth, you know, from ancient Greek are even distorted, right, to support this sort of dominant ideology. So I agree with you, but you know, I don't think it has to be the normative basis of a field, if that makes sense. Okay. Are there other questions, comments? Okay, should we move on to the next question?
Do you have any examples of what a proletarian science would look like? It was interesting. No. Oh, you do?
Oh, absolutely. We see it across North America over the past 4 decades. We see it in other parts of the world, but I'm somewhat obsessed with what's unfolding right now. The emergence of an anti-toxics movement, a working class movement, and the emergence of what was called citizen science, because of course in the United States, until recently, one has not been allowed to mention the words working class or proletarian or workers anything. You see this, although I disagree with the specific formulations and implications of the project, the work of Michelle Murphy and her lab up there at the University of Toronto, other environmental justice, which is environmental justice, working class environmentalist struggles across in the American Southwest around farm workers and the extraordinary poisoning that goes on there. And we can multiply these examples across the world in very quite extraordinary ways. So yes, there are figures even and movements that practice in terms of a tendential proletarian science. I'm not saying, you know, this is the true science. That's not what I'm saying, but precisely as Conrad was gesturing towards a counter tendency, a counter movement. And the problem is that if you're in the academies and you violate that, the norm of bourgeois science, then you suffer the penalties, right?
Okay. Jaleh, did you have anything you wanted to add further? Or no? Okay. Was it Howard? Howard with his hand up first? Okay, Howard, yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that in terms of that movement forward, it's critical to take on board, listen to, and absorb the real value of traditional ecological knowledge. There are systems of science which just haven't been explored.
Okay, yeah, for sure. Definitely true. Maybe at a higher level of epistemological density, but I think that definitely needs to be taken into account. Richard Seaford, do you want to comment?
Yeah, I'm not really equipped to contribute to this debate, but I was struck by Conrad's use of the terms metaphysical value and metaphysical abstraction when talking about our contemporary world. And I wonder what's meant exactly by metaphysical there. And this might help us to understand how one could move towards different forms of science, because what does that really mean in a modern economy? Metaphysical value, metaphysical abstraction. I mean, does it refer to something like the fact that value cannot be reduced to anything else, that it is the bedrock on which our conceptual world, or at least our conception of the economy, is structured? Does it refer to a kind of self-containment or fetishization of this abstract entity? What does it mean? Because clearly, if it does, then one way of thinking about the negative effects of real abstraction is to think of them as consisting of a kind of oppressive homogeneity in which their origin in concrete practice is constantly denied, negated, so that a different kind of science or different political conception of science would be to constantly to be challenging these homogeneous abstractions in the interests of more concrete values. But I have a question, is what exactly is meant, Conrad, when you say metaphysical value and metaphysical abstraction in the modern world? Because we're supposed to have got rid of metaphysics.
Yeah, well, I mean, like when I say that, I'm not necessarily intending to supply a technical term so much as just to stress sort of the conceptual aspect of it, right? Which isn't to say that it isn't, also borne out in terms of material practice in some form or another. Also, this goes back to the problem we have with the definition of real abstraction, right? Because I could sit here and say, well, this is a real abstraction and that's a real abstraction, which is one way of using the term. But, for Sohn-Rethel, real abstraction is commodity exchange, right? So maybe the more technical and Sohn-Rethelian way of saying that would be ideal abstractions or thought abstractions, right? Does that make sense? So no really systemic use intended, but it does speak to a certain problem in how we talk about this, right? Would you guys like to move on to the next question, or are there further? Oh, Ben again, yeah.
Yeah, if you're saying, real abstraction, commodity exchange, then you're just saying Rome, Greece are capitalist societies. They weren't. They simply weren't. That's the fallacy of, if people are making things and you're not defining money, well, then animals make things. Foxes and rabbits don't have an economy.
Does anyone want to respond to that?
I mean, what is this real abstraction? To me, it just sounds like ruling ideas people have, but they don't realize what actually rules them. It's very confusing. I know it's a very debate. I think there's something interesting there. If you're going to bring Kant and Hegel back, then all you're doing is making another sort of ontology. You're making a police regime for the imagination and how to solve these things. I don't know. I'm too confused about it. I don't want to go to Negri's thing at all.
I mean, sorry, Ben.
No.
I mean, this was actually a question that I posed to Conrad in his dissertation defense, which was a really great time of it, where I said, well, if you want to look at the actually existing real abstractions in pre-capitalist class formations, how do we do this? So if we want to look at feudalism, feudalism does not have this ruling abstraction, this ruling binary of civilization and nature as separate ontological zones. It has a conception of organic unity, the great chain of being, that emerges not only out of the circulation of commodities, which was considerable, certainly by the 12th and 13th centuries, but also through the specific historical geography of class exploitation, class structure, et cetera, et cetera. And you have to put those two moments together. And I think that was what I was struggling with earlier with Jaleh's, our back and forth, was that it's more than just real abstraction is sweated from the circulation of commodities. It's also that it has to do with dynamic with the dynamic of class politics and political rule and how those two fit together. So that late feudalism looks very different from, say, the Roman West in the early 5th century.
Yeah, I think you mentioned three things earlier that were driving things. I think the fourth one is the specificity of the banking system in capitalism. Money changes then, and you can't separate that from the imperial violence that you talk about. There's a double, there's a cash thing, but there's another one, the way, Dutch finance, that's part of Marx's thing in the chapter of primitive accumulation. And it's
that everyone forgets, right, Ben? Everyone forgets that, the creation of national debts.
Yeah. And you can't separate that out from the general equivalent.
Okay, John Thompson.
Yep. Hi. I was going to add points maybe about around the clarification debate that's going on. But it's interesting that how do the terms of real abstraction and ideology go together? Because actually there isn't, like when Jason Moore is talking, why is it better to talk about bourgeois naturalism as a ruling abstraction rather than a ruling ideology? And then my 2 cents on the understanding of the terms is that the ideology, that real abstraction points to the form in which all ideologies will have to be expressed, whereas their content could be different, but the form is the form in which it have to be expressed is that you could that idea of, well, what Richard Seaford was on about, but reducing down to sort of one, the ability to totalize a whole variety of differences as maybe a one being, or that there's one fundamental underlying, that the ruling ideology would necessarily be in that form because it's linked to the social mode of production, which is based on commodities, commodity production. If that's sort of clear, but if other people would like to make points around the relationship between real abstraction and ideology, how do either one temper each other? Thanks.
Well, if I can jump in and try to answer that. And also, I think I was the one who brought up the term metaphysics, which might have messed everybody up, but I'm going to stand by that. And again, I'm going to defer to another person who's here in this room. I want to defer to Khatib's essay entitled Sensuous, Supersensuous, The Aesthetics of Real Abstraction in the volume Aesthetic Marx, where he answers that very succinctly by saying, quote, in contrast to a traditional Marxist understanding of false consciousness, which is where the question of ideology would come in, false consciousness, ideology. It is not that ideologically produced illusions veil material relations, but rather that things produced by capitalist society, commodities in their very graphicness, veil social relations. So, and I'm going to insist that that is the use value of the term real abstraction, and that it displaces that kind of problem, ideology critique. So just to finish quoting from Khatib's essay, capitalism's physis produces its own naturally grown in quotes, metaphysics. In other words, with generalized commodity production, sensuous first nature becomes supersensuous second nature. So I think the point there isn't the use of the word metaphysics in the kind of traditional sense, but It's another way of saying that commodity production and the kind of unity of production and value realization, even though those things might take place in different geopolitical places or different temporal moments, that produces a second nature, the substance of which are social relations. And that's very different than ideology. Or to use someone else's language, Paul's language from yesterday's talk, he referred to the gap between, how did he put it? The gap between method and ontology, the gap between subject and ontology, the gap between ontology and reification. So I think it's exactly that gap which is embedded in social relations, which is displacing the problem of ideology. And that to me is the use value of this toolkit and why we need it. It's not just ideologies projected. It's that they're generated in the kinds of exchanges that originate at first in the market. So I think, sorry to put you on the spot while you're actually here, Sami, but I think that essay is tremendously useful in illuminating these terms and showing us how to use them.
But there's not one market, there's many markets.
For sure, but in concert, in this kind of messy, as Harvey says, this kind of assemblage of sites of production and markets, you get something that then begins to behave as though it were nature.
Yeah, but it's
capital
not.
Expands. Yeah, sure, it's not, but.
Well, it makes a difference.
We've talked about the issue of history, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, I think sort of the conclusion that was partly arrived at was that, if you look at a place like Athens, in ancient history, there was no way, right, that they could have related value to labor, which Marx points out of Aristotle, right, or that, because labor wasn't even sufficiently organized in a manner that it did serve as the basis of value. But nevertheless, right, because of the maritime commerce and so forth, because of the centrality of exchange to their economy and the fact they were having to assign prices to all these sort of odds and ends, right, that in that sort of social formation, right, that the notion of exchange can become very, very metaphysically central, right? So you can actually kind of look at exchange and separate circulation and production to that extent, right? And then kind of tease out the implications of it across successive eras based on the organization of different social formations, right? Richard Seaford?
Yes. In the ancient world, certainly, and it may also be true in the modern world, but the relationship between abstraction and ideology is through differential ontology. That is to say, some abstractions are more real than others, or abstractions are just real, or absolutely real. And that's how certainly how ideology works in the ancient world. I mean, to take your point about exchange and so on, there is Heraclitus in the 6th century BC who cosmizes the circulation and exchange of commodities. And it's a very persuasive view of the world. It still is, actually. Heraclitus is very fashionable these days. But we also know that for a certain period, that ideology was extremely popular among a certain group of people, and it ceased to be. And Plato was a great enemy of it. In fact, all subsequent ancient philosophy abolishes Heraclitus. It abolishes the differential ontology which privileges exchange and replaces it with the ontology that privileges value. What is real is not movement anymore. What is real is abstract substance. Now, the greater reality of abstract substance is profoundly political. Why is it political? Because it establishes a paradigm for the self-containment of the abstract substance of money as owned by people like Plato, who are not going to engage in exchange, who are ideologically bitterly opposed to any contamination which engagement in exchange would involve them in, right? So now, interestingly, and this is a point which Sohn-Rethel doesn't mention, like numerous other points that Sohn-Rethel doesn't mention. And incidentally, I mean, Sohn-Rethel's basic insight is enormously important, but what he did with it, of course, was to try and derive the basic categories from commodity exchange. What he could have done with it and what can still be done with it is earth-shattering. It's enormous. I mean, for example, I'm engaged at the moment with a collaborative project with a Hebrew Bible scholar in which you're asking the question, why is it that about the same time God in Greece and God in Israel, Judah becomes abstract, imperceptible? Why? Well, actually, there's no question of influence between the two. You can really only answer that question in relation to Sohn-Rethel's insight about the cosmic significance, fundamentally, of the exchange abstraction. Now, one thing Sohn-Rethel didn't do was to realize that there are other forms of what you might roughly call social synthesis other than commodity exchange. I mean, for example, in the city-state is small enough for ritual to function as a social synthesis. What do I mean by that? I mean that there are rituals which can involve the whole of society walking together in a procession, seeing itself as a society. That is, in a sense, a social synthesis. Now, here comes the general point, which is that with the Hellenistic monarchies and then the whole of the Eastern Mediterranean taken over by Rome, that becomes impossible. Society becomes far too big. That is a society which Christianity emerges. And there are two fundamental ancient rituals which embody what you would call a concrete social synthesis. And one is animal sacrifice, and the other is a mystery cult. And Christianity cannot tolerate the existence of those two forms of concrete social synthesis. It has to establish new forms of social synthesis. So what happens, and here's the key point, that both animal sacrifice and the mystery cult are turned into abstractions. They're turned into abstractions in the interest of the power of the church. They're no longer concrete expressions, but mere abstractions, but very powerful abstractions. Jesus was a sacrifice. That is why we are all saved. Jesus was a mystery, and so on. So these, and God is abstract, and so on. All this is derived from older social syntheses, some of them abstract, some of them concrete. Now, there was discussion of the Middle Ages. This is a cultural amalgam which contains abstractions and is inherited by the Middle Ages and ultimately by us. So that the abstractions, the ruling abstractions of the Middle Ages include Jesus Christ as a sacrifice, for example, and numerous others, which derive from the continuity of this culture, its transformations in the ancient world. And there they all are, all these ruling abstractions. They can survive to a large extent because commodity production continues to exist. In societies in which there was no commodity productions, such abstractions will be meaningless. Now, the Platonic abstraction, the ruling abstraction, the ontologically privileged abstraction of simply abstract being is profoundly political because what it does, it provides a cosmic paradigm for precisely the kind of dominance of abstract value that serves the interests of the class of people represented by Plato. So there's an example of ontology mediating between abstraction and ideology. So what I'm saying as a conclusion is that the potential for Sohn-Rethel's real abstraction, I don't mean real abstraction in the broad sense, which we haven't really defined yet, but in the narrow sense of something deriving from commodity exchange, the historical potential for seeing the way in which this ramifies into a whole number of cultural institutions and products is extraordinary. I mean, it's going on already in biblical studies and Near Eastern studies and so on. And one of the things it must do, of course, is to reduce cognitive science, which indeed it is doing. So this opens up the prospect of a growing interdisciplinarity, at least in the study of the ancient world, which is really the only world I'm familiar with. And that is my main point about the potential of Sohn-Rethel's conception. I end.
Do we have any further comments on that?
think you need to separate the ontology thing, because I think that's the worst side of speculative realism, especially the OO versions, the way they logically, it's like they're using it as a, ontology is fine if you use it as a research project, practically. But if you're going to start off logically defining what an object is, etc., etc., you're just imprisoning the imagination.
Well, absolutely. And my point is that when Plato or anybody else says, this is what is real, and this is more real than everything else, that is ideology. That is a class position.
That's a wonderful actual segue, and I find it remarkable because Ben keeps making these segues for me to the questions which I had written. So I don't know if that's intentional or what's going on. It's kind of creeping me out. It's great. But the third question I wanted to ask was about the first of all, generally about the future research agenda for real abstraction, which Richard, for example, has been discussing in terms of history. But I also want to maybe raise the question for those who are sufficiently read up on this to sort of offer their opinion. The relationship between real abstraction and the subject of ontology, right, which I'd like to address. So I think I brought this up yesterday, but I think we see a difference, for example, in the way that Toscano approaches this and the way Moore approaches this, right? Because we see Toscano starting in 2009, right? He, responding, I think, to what had happened in 2007 with this speculative realism and this revival of interest in ontology, which was not everything the speculative realist conference was about, but for many that was the takeaway. Toscano sort of says, look, like this is just kind of nonsense, right? Like you're just talking about reality. There's no political analysis. There's no economic analysis. This elides real abstraction, right? And in fact, in terms of this whole discussion about, correlationism, which I don't know if you're familiar with this term, but the idea that reality can only emerge sort of at the interstices of thought and being, right? That it's necessary for there to be a sort of cognitive mediation of it, right? Or everything we experience is always a product of cognitive mediation. If we think of this idea of correlationism, right? What Toscano says is, look, insofar as we're in a capitalist society where there's a dualistic scission enacted, and maybe I'm extrapolating from a bit, but insofar as there's a dualistic scission enacted by the commodity form, we have to accept that in a qualified way, that dualism and Kantianism is the law of the land, right? And that's something you have to start with, right, before proceeding to any other sort of metaphysical assumption or what you will. Now, by contrast, we see something quite different, well, a little different, I should say, not entirely different, but in the work of Moore, like Capitalism, the Web of Life, where Moore has said, yeah, okay, society, nature, exchange value, use value, and we have these binaries, right? This is a product of our material system. It is a real abstraction. But at the same time, if I'm not getting you wrong, Jason, I think also what you're saying is that there's a kernel of truth, right, in these movements that's being expressed in an ideological way, right? So these things are often treated as totally apolitical. They're postulated as ontology, but the search to sort of ground a more monistic kind of analysis actually does index to real political urgencies which exist, right? So I just wondered, what do you guys think about the relationship between, I guess what I'm saying is, and I think this is a way of putting it, I guess what I'm saying is, how possible is it to sort of see beyond, right? To try to begin to observe a world, beyond the commodity form, right? And beyond the sort of binaries which it imposes. Like, at what point can we be sure that what we're seeing might actually be representative of the real, right? To use this sort of term. Does anyone have any thoughts on that?
I have no precise thought, but I think it's interesting to distinguish the big thoughts we had in the 20th century. And I think there you see that Sohn-Rethel's use of the critique of the commodity form is quite unique. Because when you look at the three big uses or critiques of the commodity form in the 20th century, it started with Lukács, who claimed that the commodity form can become reflexive and in a way overcome itself because of the commodification of the particular commodity labor power. This was a kind of revolutionary use of the critique of the commodity form. And he was not criticizing the commodity form of being a totalization where everything is reified and alienated. This was then the use of Adorno. Adorno made an ideology critique. He used the critique of the commodity form as a unity of social critique and critique of ideology, and was referring to these so famous non-identical, which is a placeholder for something which is lost and not gets totally absorbed by these totalization of the commodity form, which is so quantifying the whole world and making a totally reification or a Verblendungszusammenhang. When these non-identical can be a placeholder for use value, for nature, for suffering, maybe even for communism. And only Sohn-Rethel had the aim to make of the critique, not a critique of the commodity form, but using the commodity form for a material theory of knowledge, which is something rather different from both, from Adorno and from Lukács. And maybe I think the big unification is needed. So we need to make a revolutionary use of the critique of the commodity form. We need something like Adorno and non-identical, something which is so inside the totality, but it's not totally observed. And we need this aim of Sohn-Rethel to ask, how is something like universal truth possible? Maybe with Badiou and maybe with Toscano and all these guys who are already trying to make some kind of paradigmatic use of these three big critiques of the commodity form of the 20th century.
Yeah, and I just want to add, I'm not going to go into a speech or anything, but I just want to say that I think that, you know, in light of what I feel to be Sohn-Rethel's maybe failure to recognize the historical specificity of the proletariat, I think there are some indications in Lukács we should maybe look at as well and revisit. Does anyone have a comment on this, what Frank said?
As long as it's not transcendental.
Sorry, go ahead, Ben, go ahead.
As long as it's not transcendental.
I mean, for me, how I understood Sohn-Rethel through Toscano and then by reading Sohn-Rethel is that these real abstractions are emergent properties of distinctive class societies, of distinctive modes of production. So the emergent real abstractions that come out of a certain praxis of class society realize specific forms with the emergence of capitalism in this pairing as an imperial class project of civilizing projects and bourgeois naturalism. So everything gets sorted out like that. It's a civilizational fetishism that then sets the stage for real abstractions in the realm of commodity labor power, and how that also gets dialectically joined to a series of binarized pairings with unpaid work, not just around gender, but also in other registers of domination. So what I liked is that it gave me a very, very clear historical sense, or at least a guiding thread to a historicization of these real abstractions that emerge out of imperial class politics, out of capitalist praxis. And that seemed to me to be very interesting. And then what John Thompson said earlier, everybody's been saying great things, but this is how I was going to paraphrase it, that you have these sort of originary real abstractions that then take successive and diverse ideological forms across the time and space of historical capitalism. So that, for instance, bourgeois naturalism does not look the same in the 16th century, in the era of Malthus, in the era of the late 19th century, or in the era of the so-called Anthropocene or neoliberalism. But again, you have this dynamic of old wine, new bottles that is quite powerful. And that also accounts for a lot of the bourgeois naturalism of the Marxist left, which ends up being holding to a kind of romantic view of nature because it hasn't taken seriously this dialectic of project and process, of the project of nature as an imperial class project, and then the realities of the web of life as a set of countervailing forces that are part of the fundamental contradictions of the capitalist world ecology.
Okay, I'm tempted to ask you about the real relational movements in nature, but we'll get back to that. Richard Seaford.
I just, very briefly, I thought your question was, how can we imagine a society without commodities? well, we don't have to do that. I mean, the fact is that commodity production is relatively recent in human history. Ethnology gives you countless pictures of societies which are pre-commodity, and so does literature, Homer, for example. So I'm not saying that these societies should be our model, but it would be, it's important not to ignore examples of societies without commodities and how different they are metaphysically, for example.
Okay, do you have a further comment?
Well, these examples are still there, aren't they?
Yes.
I mean even though they're disappearing fast, genocide, they're still there.
But I think the issue isn't the fact that they're there. I think the issue is that, you know, we have a certain cognitive apparatus that's been assembled across, the history of the West and other areas, and that, you know, is very dominant today in terms of our global situation. So, you know, whether, of course, we can look at examples, of like, foraging tribes, for example, and say, well, that's not, a society in which, commodity exchange nor production, right, exists. But does that really provide us with any, to what extent does that provide us with a model as to the sort of society we should be trying to build, or the kind of changes we can introduce to our science? Howard?
Yeah, there's actually, Marx gives a really interesting pairing in the Grundrisse. It's page 171, 172, where he says, look, you can either have commodity production where the private has to be transformed into the social, and so value becomes a way of certifying that this thing is social, or you can presuppose sociality, right? And so that's the idea. In other words, in looking to the future, you want to presuppose an association of individuals where sociality is presupposed, and it's not because I have a product that I exchange with another from whom I'm estranged and indifferent that gives rise to my social belonging. My social belonging is there from the get-go.
Okay, John Thompson.
Just on the point about societies that didn't have commodity forms. I think what you're trying to say, Conrad, is basically to stress the idea of a society after real abstraction, which would mean that it was a society without commodities, without the commodity form tempering how you would think, that had gone through the historical experience of it as a society or a social group. And, so it would contain some vestiges of the experience of capitalism having happened. And that's the problem with societies like we can find out a lot from looking at societies that don't use the commodity form, but they didn't have the historical experience of it. So they haven't registered what does it mean to be after real abstraction. I think it would, your point connects into the point that Sami was making earlier as well, what the bad abstractions look like afterwards. What does like the shape of the concepts we can think of look like? I don't have thoughts on that at the moment, but just to clarify. Thanks.
Well, yeah, and if the goal of communism is to sort of have the good, the productivity of capitalism without the bad, right, the violence and the inequality, right, how does that relate to how we approach the question of abstraction, right? Frank, you had your.
Yeah, I think I wanted to come back to what already Jason brought up, a topic which was quite lost in the whole conference, I think, because Sohn-Rethel said that he had two great ideas in his life. One is this real abstraction and the idea that the transcendental subject is hidden in the commodity form. But his other great idea was the logic of appropriation over the logic of production. And here he also tries to make an historical development of the origins of thought form. And this one goes, so of course, or not of course, but it goes beyond his attempt he tries to do with the other idea, which is so in particular interested in socializing Kant's transcendental subject and deliver a materialist theory of natural science. And he says that the second idea, this logic of appropriation over the logic of production, starts with the historical original sin, so to say, the Sündenfall. I don't know the English term. I think the fall, from the fall onwards, and this is a split in these original communities or ur-communities or communist ur-communities, the internal split into class societies. And he says, so with this original sin, this starting from societies becoming class societies, goes together with the split or the separation between manual and intellectual labor in the broadest sense, and goes together with the logic of appropriation over the logic of production, because now it starts that one class exploit and is living from the product which produces the other class. And then, especially in his Soziologie der Theorie der soziologischen Erkenntnis, I don't know how the English term is, he make a whole history and shows this for the different epochs in history. And he says, but only then, with the commodity form, which maybe started in ancient Greece, but when the commodity form arcs over first to natural science, and then from natural science to production, then we have a production which is totally under a universal law, which is impossible to overcome. Sohn-Rethel is, as I repeat myself again, Sohn-Rethel is not someone who says this is an ideology, natural science. He says, I want to deliver why natural science is possible and make a genesis of these validity of universal forms. And then he had the hope, what I already said and asked Jason Moore about his opinion, he had this hope that the totally, that when the production becomes appropriated or becomes produced, then the production itself becomes produced under the universal forms of natural science, then this has to end in a kind of socialist mode of production. And then he thinks in the end, the split between the logic of appropriation and the logic of production comes the same, because the logic of appropriation has arced over first to natural science and from natural science to production. Even his idea or his critique of fascism, which Alberto was referring to, has to do with his, in the 20s, in the late 20s, when there was the big economic crisis in 29, where he thought now the production is already, because of Taylorism and because of Fordism, is already socialized or in a communist way socialized. And the logic of appropriation is totally external. Like today, maybe Negri thinks with his division between multitude and general intellect on the one hand, and neoliberalism and financial capitalism on the other hand. And then he says, for fascism was the only solution to find a new mode of appropriation for a production which is already socialized, because it is under universal laws of natural science that we can maybe tailorize and making a Fordist logic inside the production process. Okay, it was a long journey, but no, I think it's good to have in mind that he has these two big ideas, and so in a way they become entangled and even should lead to a communist society in a way in the long, the vector Sami was speaking about, the vector.
Okay, and on that note, Sami.
Yeah, I would just follow up from Frank's point. We could also say, I'm also here now relying on the paper by Jamila Muscat that I found also very helpful in understanding, though it's a Hegelian path, understanding real abstraction. So, of course, we could say in intellectual abstraction, abstraction and concretion could be understood as reversible operations. So once you have abstracted, you could also concretize. As long as this is a mind game or something in natural science only, which you could somehow seal off from real effects, or if it were only in the imaginary, without any material effect in the symbolic, you could just undo it You know, it would be just fine. You abstract and you concretize. But the problem is, the moment you have an unconscious mode of socialization, which is the commodity form, real abstraction is something beyond control. That means it will cause effects that you can't reverse. I mean, you may say in climate change or even in the Anthropocene discourse, as stupid as they might be, there is some kind of, you can say, inkling about, okay, there are certain things you can't undo anymore. And the only way to change it is to modify that very mode that has created these effects which you can't change anymore. So you can also say one of the core issues of bourgeois thought is that since time seems to be infinite, which is also the logic of debt, you can just temporalize. You can also just undo all the real abstractions that have already created material effects. And that is something where I think Frank's point of his reading of Sohn-Rethel's reading of fascism is so relevant, because fascism obviously has to step in here to, let's say, you can say renaturalize, reappropriate, or ideologically or phantasmatically undo certain effects that have already been done. They have effects already in a society. I'm not so interested whether this is commodity or non-commodity or capitalist or non-capitalist society, whatever the definitions are here, and also what is the use of that. The thing is, can you undo real abstraction? Can you undo the material effects of real abstraction? And if so, what is the way? And I think Frank's reading of Sohn-Rethel, at least, I think this is something to be discussed. There is no way back. There's only a way further, without becoming a kind of a, you could say, yeah, this inverted social democracy fantasy, which might go under the name of accelerationism. You know, you just have to go further. That isn't meant by that, but it at least starts with a materialist insight in the irreversibility of certain material effects of real abstraction. And I think we can grasp them very clearly. I mean, the destruction of societies, the destruction of the planet is there. And that doesn't mean that there is not, at our moment, historical time, there are other models and the historical knowledge of what is a non-commodity production. Of course, they're very, very important, but they're precisely important from the point of view of an irreversibility of abstraction, which is not intellectual abstraction. Otherwise, we can just go all the way back. It's fine. It's just mathematics.
Totally agree with you, on that. Paul, next question, or next comment, as the case may be.
Yeah, I was just thinking through the whole of the discussion so far. First sentence of Sohn-Rethel's Manual of Intellectual Labour: a critique needs a well-defined object to which it is directed. We choose philosophical epistemology. And clearly he is, in much of the text, trying to grapple with Kant, who in 1784 writes the essay, What is Enlightenment? And the first paragraph very clearly says enlightenment is the return of knowledge to people from its, I would argue, metaphysical guise, whether it's in religion or metaphysical philosophies, where there is a power greater than us and a knowledge greater than us, and the intermediaries between us and this great knowledge, whether it's the church or early science, are the people who claim to have power. And what Sohn-Rethel does for me, which is very important, but not absolutely unique, different, but not unique from other people writing about re-understanding or relocating knowledge and the theory of knowledge, epistemology, is he says, you have to always understand it is constantly produced within the commodity form because it is produced within a form, or the precursors to commodity form because it is produced within a material and historical context and conjunction. That is always where knowledge comes from. Now, as a very basic first principle, I think that is where Sohn-Rethel is. You can then argue any degrees of the usefulness of his particular instantiated and detailed analysis, or you can argue more in general in the way in which Toscano has changed the way the term has been used somewhat, and then to an extent, there's some very, very different ways in which the term has been, the real abstraction has been used, and Sohn-Rethel's work has been used here. And it shouldn't surprise us, because if we're taking material and historical contexts and conjunctures seriously in embedding knowledge, in moving away from abstraction as an appeal to the life of the mind and towards a knowledge of where it's produced, how it's produced, abstraction as that temporary method of trying to get to grips with the world by taking some things over others, and then putting it back, we shouldn't be surprised that what Sohn-Rethel does in the context of the late 1960s and mid-1960s, and his own genealogy in relation to, for example, the Frankfurt School, and what we do now, for example, Jason's far greater focus in seeing this in relation to ecology. And I just think we have to bear that in mind. I think we have to bear in mind that when we're doing this, we are ourselves situated. You know, the transcendent form is hidden in the commodity form. And what Sohn-Rethel wants us to do is to remember precisely that the commodity form seems to naturalize that knowledge as a primary knowledge. So the fetishization of dominant sciences has largely been because of their value to production. Even the fetishization of universities and the development of disciplines has been to organize that knowledge in relation to how value is seen and how it can be exchanged. Now, within those basic concepts, what I find of value in Sohn-Rethel, perhaps I'm reading it totally wrongly, is that embeddedness, that return to real abstraction, which is not simply an ideo critique, because he is talking about the relationship between method and its subject. Ideo critiques are about the particular forms of ideological power. I think they're better represented more broadly within hegemony, that actually happen in particular times and places, whereas he's trying to give us the architecture of thinking and critiquing them. And it's a discipline. Not everything goes, not every imagination goes. It's still embedded to those central material, and yesterday I did use a term, concrete forms, which we live in while we're doing this. And if we begin to reflect on ourselves in that context, ourselves using this concept in our time and our place, even generationally across the older people like me and younger people engaged in this, we should bear in mind that what we're doing is constantly moving between recognizing that particularity of historical context and conjuncture and recognizing insights that allow us to relate it to the past, but not forget the past contextualization and project it towards the future. So perhaps in the future, we'll take weaker forms of knowledge, which have had very little value except in a very limited way of marketing and commodifying a subculture for consumption. But we might take their knowledge more seriously. We certainly take indigenous forms of knowledge more seriously. Do we ascribe them as science? The very ascription of science as opposed to other knowledges is actually a form of abstraction. Sorry, that's the end of my rant.
Okay, thank you. Very, very provocative comments. Howard?
Yeah, so going back to a number of things. First, I started out with a comment on John Thompson's point about what if capitalism didn't, I mean, you can't pretend that capitalism didn't happen. And I may have that wrong, John, but that's it was a time ago. But what I wanted to emphasize was the importance of value in the ancient world, precisely because it's not only capitalism that's at issue, it's monetization. You can't pretend that monetization didn't happen independent of capitalism. And for example, very early on in the imperial project, we were talking about the search for gold and so forth. So that issue of value and monetization in the ancient world is important. Marx has in preparatory materials for the contribution to the critique of economy, he has a passage where he says, look, circulation is pure appearance. It doesn't posit its extremes, right? And so what you have to do is understand a phenomena, that is circulation, understand the process of a phenomena running behind people's back. Okay, and so that's what's going on, right? Value is present in the ancient world, right? But it's not understood. Money is the real community, Marx says in the Grundrisse, and Richard has shown that, how money creates an impersonal bond, whereas formerly there were personal dependencies. But it's not understood how that happens, what's bringing it about. And so that then raises, how do we understand those kinds of errors? In other words, for me, like I look at Heraclitus and I say, well, wait a second, this is commodity fetishism, right? Heraclitus is taking the underlying thing, but he's attributing it to fire, something very material, very concrete, very real. Thales does the same with water, whereas Parmenides and Plato, they don't understand, and so they can't get at that process underlying the phenomena of the world that they're grappling with, that they're influenced by. So they say, well, wait a second, the conceptual abstraction is more real than whatever it is that is more real than the real, okay? And what's interesting, and I threw this out a couple of days ago, and I mean, I haven't done the research at all, but there is the question of alchemy here, because alchemy sustains that search for something underlying throughout, from the ancient world all the way to the modern world. And in point of fact, Newton devoted enormous energy to the study of alchemy. There are large notebooks. I think if it's the University of Indiana, they're online, if I'm not mistaken. So what you get then in the modern world is a breakthrough, right? In the sense, with the generalization of commodity production, the sale or purchase of labor power, what you get is a breakthrough first occurring in the natural sciences, where gravity as a real abstraction begins to explain actual things in the world, right? Then Marx, later, 2,000 years after Aristotle threw up his hands and says, I can't solve this problem, Marx gives us a solution. And so that's really fundamental, because he's explaining a process of a phenomena where the process is running behind the backs of folks. So in other words, it goes, the thing that provoked my intervention here was Sami's comment that, I'm sorry, I'm losing it. I guess the point I wanted to make is about ideology, or in other words, here it was, okay. The significance of understanding the world to transform it. So we can call money a fiction. We can call money an invention, as Sohn-Rethel does. I mean, not money. He says value is an invention in order to give us the postulate of equality. We can misrepresent, as I suggested, the pre-Socratics did, and so on and so forth. The difference is that if we don't access the real, right, the ontologically real, we can't transform the world with any reliability.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Howard. I would just stress that the gravity labor value thing is a little bit tricky in terms of the history. I think the relationship between value and surplus labor historically is very, very important, but it would be oversimple to say, in Aristotle's time, labor was the basis of value, right? So the natural scientific analogy is a little tricky.
Yeah, let me read a passage from Marx, sure. Okay? And so the really significant thing that Sohn-Rethel does is he fastens on this issue of the negation of the imperial. That's really a motivating force of real abstraction. So he says, in this manner, the labor objectified in the values of commodities is not just presented negatively as labor in which abstraction is made from all the concrete forms and useful properties of actual work. Now that we've all got that, and Sohn-Rethel makes good use of that. But what Marx wants to add is a positive feature, and that positive feature is explicitly brought out, namely the fact that it is a reduction of all kinds of actual labor to their common character of being human labor in general, of being the expenditure of human labor power. Now that occurs because folks exchange products in the market. It doesn't matter where they come from. It doesn't matter what how much labor is entering, is being calculated and so forth. The fact is, commodities are products of labor. That's his emphasis on the third thing. In other words, I said a moment ago about Aristotle, Marx solved the problem that took 2,000 years. Where did he put his solution? Chapter 1, section 1, third page of book 1 of Capital, right? We've got to understand the third thing. And there's been too little attention given to understanding the third thing. What the third thing does, first of all, it renders things commensurable. It's not exchange that makes things commensurable. It's commensurability that makes exchange possible. Okay, so what does the third thing do? First, we have to aggregate all the concrete labors in the market, right? Then secondly, once we aggregate, we negate any empirical aspect of those labors, completely ignore it, right? Thirdly, right, because we've ignored, now we can treat it as homogeneous. And fourthly, now we can apportion it to the products of labor according to their, what Marx calls, this is his term, their social weight, right? Okay, that doesn't have anything to do with human labor as a biological underlying thing. It doesn't have anything to do with a work in general as an abstraction. It's a way in which we access a social relation, the social relation of all the folks offering products in the market, their relation as laboring individuals to one another. That composite relationality is the real thing that we need to access and that existed in the ancient world and exists today, and we have to give an account of.
Yeah, I want to get on to Paul. All I would just say, and I just want to say really quickly, the relationship with labor and value would be extremely tenuous in an ancient context because it's not organized in a way that allows for that sort of simple comparison, right? If selling a good in every market is going to fetch a completely different price, then it's, you could say, well, at the end of the day, there's labor, but why say labor at that point? It's not really functioning, as the substratum of value in that context, right? So I think one has to be very careful about that application.